you, Carol. All right. On the cover of the book is the only individual landmark by Boak Raad, the Metro Theater on Broadway near 100th Street. I'm not going to talk about it today. You have to read the book, because today I'm going to talk about their tall buildings, in keeping with being here at the Skyscraper Museum. This is the only picture I was able to find of Russell Boak. He's here in the light suit. This is supposed to be a construction meeting with one of the owners of one of the buildings under development. I couldn't find a photograph of Hyman Paris or Thomas Raad, and I found a lot less biographical material about either of those two, but nonetheless, we will talk about them to the extent we can from the records. There were no archive, no obituary for these people. I had to search somewhat to find it. All right, now, up until the 19th century, we all lived and worked pretty close to the ground. 1 story up, 2 stories up, 3, 4, but there was a limit, and that was how high did people want to climb. That changed in the 19th century, which probably a lot of people on the Skyscraper know, because we had the development of steel frames. When you have masonry for every inch you go up, every foot you go up, you've got to have the foundation stone at the ground level thicker and thicker and thicker. Masonry is impractical for really tall buildings. So steel frame construction plus safe passenger elevators, those two things made it possible to build taller. And they did in the 19th century, particularly in Chicago and New York. There was a competition, the tallest building in New York, and that was usually the tallest in the world. And sometimes they held the record for a year, 2 years, but sometimes for only a matter of months, because there was this competition going on. These buildings got to be tall, but they aren't what, in your mind's eye, you probably think of as a skyscraper, which goes up in a spire. That didn't happen in New York until the zoning law of 1916. Hugh Ferris tells us that zoning law was not designed by architects. The purpose was for health and safety. Light and air needs to get down to the street, but also if you build tall buildings, chock-a-block one against the other, the lower floors don't get light and air, and they are less rentable, so the whole purpose of building up is lost. This changed with the zoning regulation, which said, depending on whether the building faced a street or an avenue, the angle at which it has to be diminished as it goes up. Hugh Ferris drew these diagrams to teach architects, this is how you can do it feasibly, practically. And you see this last one over here begins to look like buildings we can recognize as skyscrapers. He did these drawings. They were very widely circulated. In 1922, they were in the New York Times Magazine and elsewhere, and they were really very influential. And he did this with an architect named Harvey Wiley Corbett, who we will meet a little later. So Louis Sullivan said form follows function. Carroll revised it and says form follows finance, but form also follows zoning, because once you've got up to a certain, you've stepped back your building to a certain height, so that you're only dealing with 25% of the floor area of the building, you can go as high as you want. That was the rule in New York. To be able to have a tower that goes up on that 25%, you need a footprint that is rather large. You need buildings that are virtually block front. So not every building that had a small footprint could go up very far in that 25% limit, because after a while you've got more space devoted to service like elevators than you do to rentable space. So it becomes unfinancial to go up terribly high. So one of the architects who got it is a man named Emery Roth. And we have here a building that he built in 1922 for Bing & Bing, one of the real estate owners that he had as a client. And you see here, the top of the building is what was called Roth Towers. He didn't think that buildings that were well designed at their base should end with you seeing the elevator housing and the water tank. He enclosed it in masonry, and he also thought you could put apartments under those towers and have them open to the roof, and that would be attractive. Formerly, that kind of space was given to the janitor. Now he made it attractive and said it was rentable, and it was. And it must be pleasant to go out on a summer afternoon onto the roof. And you see in the setbacks, there are also balconies, terraces with balconies, so that other, not just the penthouse, but the other apartments could have outdoor space. In 1925, he built the Ritz Tower, and it was scoffed at. Oh my heavens, how would anybody want to live 40 stories up? Well, some people did. He built it for Arthur Brisbane, who was an associate of William Randolph Hearst, who eventually lived there with Marion Davies. It was a type of building called apartment hotels. It was considered that hotels were commercial. They weren't subject to the same regulation that apartment buildings, residential, were. They could be higher. They could occupy more of the lot on which they were built. And the apartments had what were called heating pantries. They didn't have kitchens. So you didn't have to have as much space devoted to fire escapes or interior fire stairs. Now, Emery Roth comes into the story because the architects with whom we are concerned came out of the Emery Roth firm. Russell Boak went to work with Emery Roth when he was 14 or 15. He'd had 1 year of high school at Stuyvesant and went to work for Roth. And this is his autobiography as recounted in the AIA application. He was a junior draftsman, senior draftsman, designer, until 1923, at which time I became an associate with Emery Roth with a 25% interest in the firm. I remained with Roth until 927 on this basis. Okay, Hyman Paris was a young architect who got his start with Gaetano Yalo, who's another apartment house architect. Sometime in the early 20s, he went over to the Emery Roth firm. So 1927, you know, the 20s was the year of the boom, a lot of construction, so they must have thought, there's enough being built, we can get some of it too. And they broke away from Emery Roth. One of them a Catholic, one of them a Jew, one of them, Boak, must have had some money out of his settlement with Roth. Hyman Paris had the architectural license already, so he could sign the applications to the Department of Buildings for new buildings. Boak was principally the architect of facades, Paris interiors, but of course they have to cooperate together in apartment buildings. So 1927 to 42, they have this firm. What was their first building? It's in White Plains. It's has Tudor style features. It is not at all the style that Emery Roth built. Who were the owner developers here? It's Perry Boak. Boak and Paris, Perry Boak. Do you hear something there? Yes. Okay, yes, they were the owner developers of this building in White Plains. I'm told that a mayor of White Plains lives there. It's still a distinguished address. At about the same time, they were designing this building at Broadway and 106 for William J. Hanna, who was a client of Emery Ross. It's in the style of Italian palazzo, and here, if you can see them, these heads, I speculate that they're Florentine bankers because down here at the corner was a bank, so it makes sense. The heads are done in terracotta, and it has a cornice and a terracotta, quite substantial detail. Shortly, they did another building for Hannah. This is on Central Park West and 104th Street. It has, notice the verticality, and it ends in what we would consider a skyscraper silhouette. The setbacks and the terraces. Hannah himself had a custom designed apartment in this building, probably the penthouse. The terracotta heads here, for some reason, they're pelicans. I have not figured out why pelicans on the building, but this building has an interesting social history. Yul Brynner lived there, Lee Grant, and a number of Hollywood screenwriters who were blacklisted in the McCarthy era. It was called a red building, Little Kremlin, because of the number of people, leftist people who lived there. And so it's interesting, we might dwell on this building and think what their career might have been like, designing for the relatively affluent, not the really wealthy, they're on the other side of Central Park, but people who have enough money that they have servants, because this building included maids' rooms. However, October 29, 1929, the crash. Construction fell off enormously, but some people who had their finances in relatively good order could proceed, maybe downsizing their design somewhat. These two are for Bing and Bing. Bing and Bing built 7 or 8 buildings about the same time in the Abington Square district because they realized that the I&D subway coming in mean that people could commute either downtown to Wall Street or uptown to the emerging Midtown Business Center. So this would be a strategic place to build. These are 16 stories plus penthouse, but apartment hotels in each case. In 1930, Arlington City Hall had a dilemma. By that time, Gaetano Aiello, with whom he'd built a number of buildings on the west side, had retired. And he needed a new architect. He owned property on the north and south of 104th Street and Riverside Drive. This one was built by Leo Knust for him, but he also owned the property where a building would go up next to this one. I think he thought, do I want to look to the past or to the future? And remembering that Hyman Paris worked for Gaetano Aiello, apparently he got in touch with the young firm and commissioned them to do the building that would stand next to, this is the Masters building. This is a very interesting building in itself by Harvey Weil Corbett and others. It is the master to which reference is made is Nicholas Roerisch, an artist who, among other things, did the scenery for Shostakovich, the Rites of Spring. And so this building includes an art gallery for his paintings, theater, and apartments above. They have cork floors. I imagine that's because for musicians you want soundproof flooring. So here we have the Masters at 103rd and Riverside and what Boak and Paris built to go beside it, 315 on 104th. It seems to be a building that responds to the Masters, partly I suppose because zoning had the setbacks come at the similar place. But you see it's shorter. Why? The Masters Hotel, the Masters building was an apartment hotel, one of the very last. the city fathers realized that people were doing a little bit more than just warming in their pantries. And so they decided it was a category that wasn't a good category to permit to go forward, and so it has been abolished, and there are just regulations for residential. Please notice in the master building the windows at the corner. Hugh Ferris tells us that people were astonished to see the corners have windows, because that's where you'd expect a column to hold it up. Yes? Well, those who knew what was going on knew that there were steel columns elsewhere that held up the building, and this could be open to steel casement windows. Arlington C. Hall had another building down, this is Riverside Drive and 74th Street. I took this picture several years ago before renovation. Since then, it's been renovated, and the steel casement windows have been restored to this corner of the building. They're a little bit smaller than the one in the master building, but yet, you know, obviously they had learned from the master building. There is the 3132 is considered the depth of the Depression, and although Boak and Paris had had quite a lot of work through 31, even this dried up. Sam Minskoff had been a client of Emery Ross. He built his last building with Emery Ross that was completed after Boak and Paris had left the firm, but it opened 1 month after the crash. It was a luxury apartment house at 480 Park Avenue, and I think it must have been slow to rent up. Sam Minskoff didn't build apartment buildings for a while. When he did again, this one is only 10 stories, and he's quoted as saying, "There's a very marked trend towards smaller and smarter apartments. No matter how skillfully remodeling is undertaken, the results can never equal dwellings which are built to the purpose. The small apartments require planning of a specialized nature if its facilities are to be complete." Now that remodeling, a good bit of bread and butter work that architects had in the Depression was to subdivide these large apartments of the wealthy into 1, 2, maybe 3 apartments. So this was one that wasn't just carved out of other buildings or apartments. There finally was an uptick in construction. In 1936, there was a boomlet. And this building, 50 East 78th, is one that of several Sam Minskoff commissioned from the firm. And there is, in this article on Architectural Forum, they say something which characterizes most of the owners that Boak and Paris worked for. Building for investment rather than quick resale influenced both plan and construction, and minimum upkeep and slow obsolescence became important factors. In designing the building, the type of apartments considered most rentable were first worked out, then costs were estimated, and final decisions as to materials and exterior design were made on the basis of those controlling elements. In terms of materials, as far as I know, Boak and Paris didn't continue to use terracotta after this time. They used cast stone instead, which is a simpler manufacturing process and consequently cheaper. And so that's one way that decisions were made about materials. But this seems to characterize the owners that they usually built for. They first know the market, control your costs, and then decide what plan for the long term, because these people built on their own account. They built and then rented them, so they intended to own them and have the income from rentals. This was true of most of the developers for whom Boak and Paris and eventually Boak and Raad worked. I said 36. Oh, this is interesting. This appeared in a real estate magazine. Here we have the Rockefeller Apartments. The Rockefeller Apartments were the most written about apartments in the time. They were the most important apartments going up, just as Rockefeller Center was the most important construction going up at the time. So here are construction photographs, Rockefeller Apartments and 50 East 78th side by side. It must have made Boak and Paris rather happy to see their building pictured with the Rockefeller Apartments.
Which is the Rockefeller?
Wallace Harrison, and was it Bravo was in the first, but it's the same. The Rockefeller, yeah. Excuse me. I told you Minskoff had several projects going, one of them being the building I live on. In the papers they said it's a tall building, it's 9 stories. In that neighborhood, which is Washington Heights, most of the buildings were 5 or 6 stories, so it's tall in comparison to those. But you see this very strong element to show the verticality of the building. It has the corner casement windows, it also has dropped living rooms, which were popular in the 1930s. The apartments are 2 rooms to 5 rooms, which made for a mix of size of families, ages, incomes to a certain extent. And it had a bath for every bedroom, which was not always the case at the time. I'm particularly fond of the front doors. There's a floral pattern which actually carries over into the lobby. They spent a lot of care on their entrances and their lobbies, and they often had them relate to one another. Across the intersection is another Minskoff building. It's bulkier, it's same height, but spreads out more than ours does. However, at the same time, they were doing 5 Riverside Drive, which is at the foot of Riverside Drive. It has the nice vista of looking out over Riverside Park, which Robert Moses had the covered over the New York Central tracks to create a park. This one, somewhat like for 444 Central Park West, is more of a luxury building. It had provision for maids' rooms, and it's here at Riverside Drive and 73rd. Between this and 22 Riverside, which they'd done earlier, was the Schwab Mansion, and so they could look from this building to 22 across the gardens of the Schwab Mansion. You may think, oh, this is a detail that was published in pencil points. This is the entrance on the Riverside Drive side, the revolving door, keep out the wind, presumably. And although the magazine didn't give the address of this building, I knew from what they published which building it is. You see the grill work on the windows is rather nice. You may think that they only built on the west side. That's almost true, but they did build a few places on the east side. And here are 2 of them. Boak and Paris, they have 4 on Riverside Drive, 2 on West End Avenue, and 6 in Washington Heights, Inwood, and Marble Hill. So, you know, they were pretty oriented to the west side because that's where development happened before the war. After the war, it flipped. All of the Boak and Raad post-war buildings are on the east side are Greenwich Village. There's none at all on the west side. This one is at 5th Avenue and 9th Street. A contemporary real estate website said about it, designed by Boak and Paris, 25th Avenue is a transitional work for the district. completed in 1939 when few large-scale luxury dwellings were being constructed in the city. Its architecture represents an intriguing interperiod mix of Jazz-age historicism and the post-war functionalism to come. Currently it's Mahoney and Porcelli, but originally it was the first Howard Johnson in Manhattan. Howard Johnson had his office on the second floor because he was building a lot of his iconic orange roof and aqua cupola buildings in anticipation of the World's Fair. So he needed to have an office for his New York projects. A new owner, David Rose, who previously had only built in the Bronx. This is the Westmore. It's a building that it stretches from 57th mid-block through to 58th. The two buildings are go through a garden with a covered enclosed walkway between. To me, it is a little bit reminiscent of the Rockefeller Apartments because of the bays. These are more shallow, but the Rockefeller Apartments also were through the block from 54th to 55th, and both of them are rather low buildings. You see a somewhat different aesthetic coming in. You're not the only one. Robert A.M. Stern, in his book New York 1930, which is a book about pre-war New York, didn't mention these buildings, although they were built in 1940. He did give them a glancing mention in his book, that is his post-war book, New York 1960. Here, some similar aesthetic, they very, very plain. This one, at the back, you see balconies. Those balconies overlooked the gardens of what was then the cottages on 2nd Avenue. So the balconies were very private and had a nice view to the gardens. We have World War II intervening. That's from 1941 to 1945. I don't know what Hyman Paris did after he split from Boak, but Boak took a new partner in 1944, Thomas Raad. Excuse me. Here we have a building for David Rose again. It has elements that look pre-war. The bays, the balconies. It has sunken living rooms. And here's for some Minskoff and Queens. And now look where the balconies are. They're at the corners. Could you choose a more public place for a balcony compared to the private place where the pre-war buildings had them? But you see, it still retains some details that you might think were pre-war. One of the things I learned is real estate agents who talk about pre-war and post-war as a hard and fast line. Not quite true. The Dolger Block. The Dolger Block had been in the 19th century a big brewery, occupying this whole block from 1st Avenue to Sutton Place South, 55th to 56th. There were two, facing Sutton Place South, there are two tall buildings that overlook the East River. On 55th, there are low buildings which have a zigzag shape, giving them more of a view of the East River from each apartment. It's interesting that How to Marry a Millionaire was filmed in 36 Sutton Place South. Sutton Place South, they used reinforced concrete instead of structural steel. Now, there was a new journal formed post-war called the Real Estate Forum, and the material was supplied by the Real Estate Board of New York, and every real estate board firm received a subscription. The feature articles, the format was a feature article on some building, and it was dealt with in detail with a lot of pictures. The architects, the owners were described, and every contractor, subcontractor, supplier was mentioned in this long feature article, and every contractor and subcontractor and supplier took ads in the magazines. Nonetheless, it was quite a useful research tool for me because it gave me information about the buildings that Boak Raad did. They had their buildings were 13 feature articles in 17 years, which is quite a few of their buildings being mentioned, being featured. Here, I think we really see the turn, the transition. This building, Park Gramercy or Gramercy House at Lexington and 22nd, there's an early rendering which shows it looks more pre-war. The balconies, the two colors of brick, so on. As built, it was very much plainer. However, it did have an innovation. David Rose didn't like to have window air conditioners dripping on pedestrians. He thought that was not good. So he worked with General Electric to develop a through-the-wall air conditioner. Now, air conditioners had a profound effect eventually on post-war apartments. Keep noticing as we go through what happens to windows in these apartments. Here is a building that is a block front. Captain Randall had given his farm to build Sailor's Snug Harbor, but the trustees of the farm realized that that was not a very economic thing to do. The land was in Greenwich Village. It would be much more beneficial to open their home for the aged and decrepit sailors on Staten Island, which they did, and lease the land to provide an income to support Sailor's Snug Harbor. So it had been covered with a lot of townhouses, of course, row houses. But the area had become run down and decrepit, and it was redeveloped. The trustees leased the land to builders who built larger apartment buildings, and this is one of them for David Rose. This was for Sam Minskoff. Minskoff had the firm both pre-war and post-war, building quite a few commercial buildings in White Plains, where you remember the Broad Park Lodge was. This to me looks like they'd been looking at Le Corbusier, the strip windows, their pilotes. However, Corbusier had the whole building raised on pilotes. Here they just flanked the entrance, and it's a very symmetrical building, as most of their buildings were. So, whereas Le Corbusier wouldn't necessarily have made the building symmetrical. Here is the Brevoort. It is replaced the Brevoort Hotel, which no longer met code, so they could only operate the restaurant. They couldn't operate the rooms. We're into the second generation of Minskoffs here. It is a white brick building, light tan building, but certainly of that era. You see the corner balconies, not corner casement windows in this case. It is an H-shaped building. There's a porte cochere so that the cars can pull in to deposit the residents at their doorstep. At the same time that the Minskoffs leased the land for the Brevoort, they leased the land, the rest of the block, Brevoort East and then built on it later. This is a taller and bulkier building with stores on the University Place front. The entrance is around on 9th for more privacy. Another block front building for Seckles on 2nd Avenue. It was said in their write-up that it was colonial. To me, the only thing colonial was the windows down here for First National City Bank. They are 8-on-8 sash windows. The rest of the building, colonial is stretching things to call that building. All right, but this was one of the buildings that the 2nd and 3rd Avenue L's were torn down, and then there was a great building boom on the east side. Boak and Raad both applied for membership in the AIA in 1957. They were both age 61. They could have applied much earlier. I don't know why they waited so long, but maybe the year before they applied, they lost the commissions on 4 different buildings. So I wonder whether they didn't think we would do better if we could add AIA to the end of our names. The only building that I know, the only public building I know that the firm ever built is the Forest Hills Branch Library. The stairway is in this windowed tier. It has an auditorium underneath, which I imagine is well used by the community.
That's where I grew up.
Okay, you know this library? Okay, fine. Again, for the Rose Associates, here's the Hawthorn, which has an articulated front. You see it permits very, very shallow corner windows. It's white brick and gray brick. This presented a particular challenge because the Turtle Bay Creek runs underneath. They had to shore up the foundations to channel the creek to not undermine the foundations of the building. Embassy House stands at 2nd Avenue, and half of 47th Street was widened by tearing down the buildings that face 47th Street to create a mall, the Dag Hammarskjöld Plaza, leading to the UN. They call it Embassy House. I assume they had ambitions to have diplomats live there. I passed it the other day on a walk, and you can't see those towers from the street. You know, that's the way, you know, if you stand just across the street from it, the towers are too far back, so you don't realize it has towers. This is a project built with the Mitchell-Lama program. That was a state program for limited equity co-ops. That means that it was affordable to middle income people, and when people sold their apartment, they couldn't get back more than they had put in originally as equity. The Rose Associates commissioned a number of architects and did a number of Mitchell-Lama projects. This one's in the Bronx. To me, it's somewhat like the Hawthorn with the articulated fronts. They used the same interior decorator to design the lobbies of both of these. So I think I know they took great pride in having built one kind of affordable housing. The Murray Park is a red brick building on 34th Street, and it will go down in history because it was the home of Ayn Rand for many, many years. Thomas Raad retired in 1965, and Russell Boak continued and finished this building, Tower 53. Rose Associates being consultant to Lowe's Theaters. It's a mixed-use building. Up to the break, it's commercial. Looking at the register to be, I saw more doctor's office than anything else. Above is residential, and you see that there are balconies projecting. As I pass it on my way to the museum to MoMA, I don't see evidence that people use the balconies very much, but you know, it's Midtown. It has two separate entrances. The residential is on the side street, the commercial is on the avenue. It was a building that benefited in height from the zoning which permitted higher height if there were plazas provided. The plaza at the corner seems to be permanently occupied by Lindy's Restaurant outdoor seating. The other plaza, to me, it doesn't look like the owners are providing much of amenities to the public, but you know, that they got the height bonus for it. It's the tallest building that Russell Boak ever built, but in the district of a number of tall buildings, it doesn't appear especially tall. I had the good fortune to be contacted by a woman who worked for Boak in Paris, Gertrude Sklar-Bell, and she told me, she knew them, but she worked for them, Boak and Paris, the pre-war group. She told me if it hadn't been for Sam Minskoff, they would have gone bankrupt because he seemed to have money when other people didn't. She told me that Boak was quite handsome. She thought he looked like Gary Cooper. And Paris was short. He didn't have an enemy in the world, and all of his friends were showgirls. So, questions, discussion?
Were they Jewish?
Hyman Paris, yes. Boak was she thought Episcopalian, but I'm sure she knew who was Jewish because she took the Jewish.
Who's the she?
Gertrude Sklar-Bell. And she knew that he was Jewish. She thought Russell Boak was Episcopalian. I think he was Catholic, but because his mother was French, and you know, but I'm not sure. Episcopalian or Catholic.
But the reason I'm asking is because Jewish developers like to hire Jewish architects, and there was discrimination in general against Jewish architects. And
Okay.
Jews generally, Eli Jacques Kahn being a prominent example.
Okay, among the owners their clients, Sam Minskoff certainly was Jewish. David Rose. Arlington C. Hall was not. I mean, you look him up in the New York Times, and he went to Florida and went on cruises and so on. He was not. But the Emery Roth firm already broke had some Jews in his employ. But this was, in the 30s, it was not too common to have a firm that had both a Christian and a Jew as leadership. Yeah. So, other questions about? Yeah.
Was there a time that people started to buy their apartments?
Oh yes.
And did Boak and Paris, Boak and Raad change the development, particularly the floor plans of the buildings to accommodate purchases?
They didn't build late enough for the heyday, the big heyday of the co-op-y. The Rose firm has co-opted almost all their buildings, and in many cases they still have the management contract, so they're still in touch with the buildings that the Rose firm put up. That firm continues. The Minskoff firm, the splintered. The White Plains International Style office building is still owned and managed by Minskoff descendants. But so the answer to that is no, they didn't build for the co-op market, but many of their buildings are now co-ops or condos. A few of them are still by conversion. A few of them are still rental.
You
Yeah.
could also just ask, in
Yeah.
your book, there are virtually no floor plans.
I
And I
know.
was wondering, is there no documentation of the plans of their apartment buildings?
There's quite a bit where, there's a wonderful collection at Avery, the real estate brochures collection, and where the buildings are have information on them, they do have floor plans, and the floor plans are, pretty interesting. One of the things that was true, they had a lot of irregularly shaped buildings that the Broadway and 106 is irregular shape. The building I live in, 250, it's 2 apartments at the end that we saw, spreads out, and it's 3 at the other end. And a number of their buildings, they had to overcome irregular plots and dealt with it rather well. Yeah. Yes.
In the early commissions, you talked about there was that prominent element at the top of the building that enclosed the water tank, I believe.
Yeah, Roth Towers, yes.
Right, they built masonry to cover that.
Yeah.
But I noticed through the years they continue to use that element. Are there still water towers up there, or is this just
Water towers or elevator housing, yes. Yeah. Because, if you've got a building where you see it from top to bottom, then that's prominent, and how you treat it is part of how you treat the whole design. When in the later years, these tall ones, only people on higher floors of other buildings see the top of them, but still they're usually enclosed as far as I know. Yeah. Yes.
I'm just fascinated that they did so many buildings and I never heard of them, and I don't think anybody else had ever heard of them. What was going on?
Because
Besides
they're
Mr. Stern leaving them out.
Stern lived in one of their buildings, actually.
This is like you said, Lindy's and these are prominent buildings. Who do you think Emery Roth did them or something?
That happens sometimes. There's sometimes ads for some of their buildings, and it says Emery Roth building. And, they came out of Emery Roth. That's not too surprising. There is a second tier of architects who did a lot of work. Schwartz and Gross, High Feldman. There are a number of architects. Okay, there are a number of architects who are somewhat below the radar, who did fine work. The Boak and Paris buildings, a number of them are in historic districts, and a few of the Boak and Raad buildings are in historic districts on the east side, or Greenwich Village. All right, pre-war, 12 of their buildings are in historic districts scattered around Manhattan, and post-war, 4 of the Boak and Raad buildings are in historic districts. But I think one can say that they're contributing buildings in historic districts. Sometimes there's no objection from the Landmarks Preservation Commission if somebody wants to tear down a building because it's non-contributing. It's not the spirit of the historic districts. I think theirs qualify as contributing. Yes?
You mentioned the pelican on
444 Central Park West, yes.
I'm going to go look, because in literature, pelicans are symbols of Jesus.
Yes.
I wonder if somebody who owned that building had delusions of grandeur.
Not Jesus. The symbols of charity.
No, even of Jesus, Christopher.
Well,
That-
they're used in religious paintings, but
Yes.
as a metaphor for charity. That's what they're.
Okay, yes, because the
the
myth
because they protect their breath.
breast to feed their young.
Yeah, that's what people thought.
However, I have seen pelicans on hotel buildings. I think it became you know, a detail that was copied, and I don't necessarily know that it had that symbolism. I wondered myself.
Did they draw it, or was it a catalog pelican? There's a pelican on the Woolworth building.
Okay, and what's the significance on the Woolworth building?
I don't know that it necessarily had a symbolic significance.
Yeah.
But my question goes to, and which the Woolworth building, Gail Ginsky, I think would, if not stake her career on it, posit that there were decorative artists, not Xlibris architects, who were drawing some of the details because they sub-commissioned some of the decorative work, and then Atlantic Terracotta made them. So maybe there were some leftover pelicans.
From 1912 to 19, yeah, that's quite a while.
How much of the, are there no drawings that survive, and can you tell how much of the commission, to what extent they executed every detail of the commission, or was it just?
No, I really don't know, and you know, there's no archives of their drawings. I was told that when Russell Boak was going blind, that's why he closed the office, he gave the drawings to the buildings, said, you know, you have more use for them than anyone does. So there's no archive of those. But whether a drawing would tell you whether it's a stock piece or designed, I'm not sure. I'm not sure, yes.
Or, well, but you would know if it had their stamp on it, if it came out of the office as opposed to decoration here or something, you know.
I'm sorry, I don't know
So
the answer.
there are no drawings, so you really can't tell if they designed all of the ventilator grills and things like that.
They would have designed everything like that, yeah. Or, well, I don't know. Off the shelf, maybe some. But they, in their lobbies, for example, they tried to make it adhere, you know, to have the design be related, the grill work and the plaster overhead and so on. Bill?
You asked us at one point to look at the windows as we went through the years, and you never came back to it.
Oh, okay. Okay. Air conditioning and windows, all right? The windows got to be wider and wider, you know, more glass. And in the 30s, they tried to build so that you could get cross ventilation. The buildings had odd corners, and this was the goal. Believe me, it didn't keep buildings cool enough in hot summer in the 30s, but that was the goal. With air conditioning, okay, all that glass, rooms heat up, we'll just deal with it with air conditioning. So now we're to a different stage and think, you know, we've got an energy problem. We're spending a lot of money doing a lot of resources, air conditioning things. Is that the wise way to design? Should we rethink and maybe revisit some of the historic ways that architects have dealt with heat and ventilation? Yeah, sure. Sorry, you caught me on that.
So
yeah.
you say that the air conditioning killed the corner casement steel window?
All right, the corner casement windows, they're very old. They go back to Tudor times. And the point of a casement is it opens, you can open it 100%, whereas sash, you can only open 50%, you know, because you get one sash overlapping the other. You can also angle casement windows to catch a breeze. They did fall out of favor because there's a variety of things. If they're not maintained, they don't stand up forever. and also that if you distribute the windows differently, you get more light into a room than having it just at the corner. In some of the buildings, they were treated more or less like a solarium. The 30s were wild to get sun. They thought it was extremely healthy. That was part of the physical fitness of the era. But, you know, it was carried too far, of course. So, yes?
You mentioned the shift in the positioning of the balconies. I was curious if there was some kind of a trend, or if they sort of had a different take on it over the years, or if there was a structural or practical consideration for that shift.
The balconies, probably they were requested by the owners and developers as much as anybody, because there was a time when balconies counted as half a room, and you don't have to build walls and windows for a balcony, although if you go and look at the Brevoort, a lot of people have glassed in their balconies, recreating that corner casement, the corner window, because balconies are relatively impractical in this climate. But there was a time that when balconies were certainly discouraged, because you could get credit at half a room without using as much material to construct them. Our real estate lawyer said to us, "Oh God, you don't have balconies. You're so lucky. Balconies are constant water problem." Yeah. So, yes.
Are any of the lobbies or the entrances just razzle-dazzle Art Deco?
A number of them.
Design it or some-
Yes, I think they did. I think they took great care. Yeah, they often had terrazzo in very nice forms, compass. They're quite handsome. And if our building, the landlord who owned it in the 50s didn't have enough money to modernize, so we have a lot of surviving elements and restored it recently. Doing paint analysis, so we found out what colors, and it was a variety of colors were used in the ceiling and the wall. So yes, there are a lot of good lobbies. If you see the list in my book, you can poke into lobbies and see. Thanks.
Did you have much trouble asking just to go in and see the lobby? Did you have to say, I'm writing a book, or? I know the building's kind of looking like.
It depends. For the most part, I met some doormen who were very proud of their buildings and said, "Yeah, come on, I want you to see it." And there were others who were more standoffish. One place I wasn't allowed to photograph the lobby if I didn't get in touch with the managing agent. So it varied. But for the most part, I was able to see lobbies at least. I did, one summer, I went to 50 East 78th Street, which is still a rental building, and they had 4 rental apartments available, there are 4 to a floor. So there was 1 of each, an A and a B, a C and a D. And I went there and looked at them and I said, "Oh my heavens, I'm in my building," because all of the hallways had the same tile as our building. Now these were built exactly the same time, same owner, same architect. So I think, they just doubled the quantity of tile that they ordered. But I haven't been in too many apartments of their buildings.
You have a wonderful quote on the back by Ellie Rose.
Yes.
Did you interview him? This is a reminiscence
No.
for those who haven't read the back cover. Boak was an unsung architect who was incapable of doing a bad drawing, a bad design. No one is comparable. Boak just had taste. He had class. So
Yeah.
that was an interview that you did, or
no,
was there much more?
Andrew Dolkart interviewed him on videotape, and I watched those interviews, and then I was in touch with him. But I think that's a quote out of the interview that Andrew Dolkart did with him.
And do you know that some of the Rose archives, as they were, the boxes
Yes,
and things,
yes.
went to Columbia?
Yes, I know that. I know. So I haven't seen them all. I've seen some drawings from there, but you know, I haven't looked at them all.
They're not drawings. They're mostly records of either pamphlets or construction photos, ledgers, things like that. They're not architectural drawings.
That's interesting. So, yes.
Did the architects reside in any of their buildings?
Yes, I should have said that. You know, the one, the Westmore, that just pre-war, the one I said was this one. Russell Boak lived here from soon after it was built until his death in 1981, and the Rose Company had its offices there until the 1950s. What Elihu Rose said about this building is David Rose, his uncle, had built buildings in the Bronx, and he said, we tiptoed into Manhattan with this building. All right, so thank you very much.
So for those of you who are new, I'm Carol Willis. I'm the founder, director, and curator of the museum. So if you're here for the first time, welcome. I see some familiar faces, but those of you who haven't been here before, I hope you'll take a chance to look around this particular exhibition called 10 Tops. It's not a top 10 list, it's a 10 tops list. The tallest buildings in the world, 100 stories and taller. And what happens up at their uppermost floors. So the museum tries to alternate between looking at historical issues, especially around New York, and also contemporary building around the world, which is the subject of this particular show. But really our heart of hearts is with New York City and New York City history. So it's really a delight tonight to be able to take one of the people who's often sitting in the audience chair and put her up in front of everybody else. Annice is going to be talking about, as you well know, a work that has consumed a decade, more than a decade, of her architectural historian career. And has produced a very definitive work on architects that always should have been better known and were known to a lot of people who frequent the Upper West Side and other streets of New York. But Boak and Raad, and Boak in Paris and Boak and Raad, as you can see from the cover of the book, created some of the most delightful, vivid Art Deco buildings in the city, and these are the foreground buildings, but there are a lot of background buildings too, and up through the residential apartment towers, the kind of classic white brick high-rises that line New York streets and created the middle-class housing for the city. They really represent the practice of architecture which excels in its own kind of localized development, I think. They're not names that are well known in the history of American architecture, but certainly some that deserve to be well known in New York. So Annice gave them identity. And so I guess she's the one to talk about it, so I'll let her get up and illuminate this interesting firm and the careers of both Paris and Raad.